You need two more, so now we can start.
No, we're waiting on a quorum. Yeah. All right. So what? We'll just open it up, I think, in general to questions back. So we've kind of finished our baseline discussion. I think we've agreed on where we sit in general in terms of kind of diverging standards of evaluation for epistemic truths. So, or epistemic standards for evaluation of truth. So we'll go now just basically to open comment and discussion. So to anybody who wants to open or put the first question or comment out, the floor is open.
I can make the case for a couple of the alternative hypotheses.
Okay.
If people are interested in that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that in the book, a lot of the alternative hypotheses, including hallucinations and swoon theory, are dismissed using a lot of evidence outside of the five agreed upon facts, first of all. I think they're fairly plausible. Another plausible explanation is that the body was reburied. It was buried on Friday and then reburied after the Sabbath. And another plausible explanation, this one given fairly recently in a peer-reviewed journal called A New Natural Interpretation of the Tomb, is sort of a variant of the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus was still alive when they first took him down. They didn't know that. They took him away. He died a little bit later. And while he was alive, in order to prevent people from coming to get him again, they had set up a decoy in an empty tomb so that people would think that he had been there, whereas in reality, they had taken him somewhere else. He died. They buried him in a different tomb. So those are four different hypotheses. I think the hallucination hypothesis fits in with the others. It doesn't really explain everything on its own, but when you combine it with some of the other theories, then it makes a stronger case. With the swoon theory, for example, some evidence for that is that Jesus was not on the cross very long. In fact, I think it's in Mark, maybe it's in Matthew, when they go to Pilate and say that he's died, they want to take him down. Pilate's surprised that he's dead because it hasn't been very long. We also know from Josephus at least one example of someone surviving crucifixion after being taken down early. So it's not impossible that he survived. And there's some evidence in the Gospels themselves that he survived. And I think that's probably a likely passage to have some historical accuracy to it because it does point to the possibility of a survival. So if it wasn't true, they probably would not have included it in the write-up. Also, more evidence for the swoon theory is that Jesus' body, when he's supposedly seen in some of the later appearances, shows wounds. They don't recognize him at first. And that's in contradiction to Paul, who says that Jesus is resurrected in kind of a super glorious body, which doesn't have wounds. So I don't think the appearances in the Gospels are generally accurate, but if you take some of those details as accurate, then that adds to this possibility of swoon theory.
Okay, well, say the last thing again. I was trying to take some notes. You said glorified bodies do not have wounds?
Yeah, according to Paul.
Where is that?
His discussion of, because they're not capable of wounds the way that it's described. It's like this immortal, imperishable, undamageable super body.
Where is that?
It's in Corinthians, I think he talks about it.
Do you have a verse? Excuse me.
I'll have to look for it later. I have a condition with my vision right now. I can't read.
Okay.
A glorified body. I don't know that he describes the glorified body in much detail, but it seems inconsistent with the wounded body.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any verse that suggests that a glorified body couldn't show wounds that were sustained in life or anything like that. But we'll look for it. We'll
This
continue.
is 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 44.
32. Okay.
42 through 44. 42, so also is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown a perishable body. It is raised an imperishable body.
Yes.
It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. So
So that-
imperishable.
Yeah, that to me doesn't seem consistent with descriptions of Jesus' body in the Gospels. But the Gospels are all over the place anyway, and their accounts have multiple contradictions and different stories. So,
Okay. Well, I don't. I'll
But
say
anyway, if you agree with the
that I don't
gospel-
accept that they have multiple contradictions in different stories. I do. I see what you're saying on an imperishable body. An imperishable body may not be one that sustains wounds, but if it is sown with wounds that are glorious, then it may be reaped with wounds that are glorious. That is to say, kind of the Maximus, what we do here, echoes in eternity kind of idea. That for our glorified bodies, presumably our glorified bodies, theologians would say something like, might reflect the best parts of us. That the things that we have in our glorified bodies would be things that speak to both our personality and actions, and would be a way of, and the differences in our appearance would be ways of differentiating between people. And if some of our future glorious life has to do with how we were in the past, in Jesus' case, the maximum sacrifice that he gave, the ultimate sacrifice that he gave, would be in some ways displayed in that body, say theologians. So they don't think it's inconsistent with the description. They think it's entirely consistent with that
That's in
description.
theologians where it talks about the best parts of you being preserved in your spiritual body.
Say it again.
Oh.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
not a book, sorry.
Yeah, no, not a book. Yeah, this is a Christian interpretation that would say something like, that's just reasoning inductively about how our glorified bodies might be, which is the same kind of reasoning you're doing of saying, well, if it's imperishable, then it therefore couldn't have any signs of what it was like in life.
right. I mean, there's no way for us to know. It's just some people want to. To me, the plain reading is that Paul is saying that there's no injuries to the body. It's not even really.
I disagree. The plain reading of the data.
Right, I know you have a different interpretation.
No, I'm saying the plain reading of the data, the total data, the evidence that we're talking about. The plain reading of that evidence is multiple people attesting to multiple people, but one particular area attesting to Jesus' displayed wounds. And Paul doesn't comment on it straight out. You're taking an inference from what he said, and that if he has a glorified body, he therefore couldn't have wounds. I don't see the connection necessarily.
Paul wrote many years before the Gospels. I think the Gospels are telling different stories that have developed over time. They're not.
Right, but I
They're
disagree.
not accurate historical retellings.
I disagree with that, and so do many of the scholars too.
Right, I think. Well, but not most scholars. That's why the details of those physical.
You don't think most scholars agree that
No, that's why they're not included in the 5 facts. If Habermas could have included all these details from the Gospels in the 5 facts, he would have. But he couldn't, because most scholars don't agree with those 5 facts, because most scholars think that there are contradictions and that the stories in the gospel, in the resurrection elements of the gospels particularly are very unreliable. So you can get maybe bits and pieces out of them, but very little that we can reliably attest to.
Yeah, I disagree with your characterization of what most scholars agree with. That I think that most scholars accept many more of the details that are presented in the historical recollections here in the Gospels than you're stating.
And why hasn't Habermas included them in the 5 facts?
Because the whole purpose of the argument is to be the most minimal possible argument. So if you're going to write an argument, the purpose of which is to be, if you're going to write an argument, the purpose of which is to be the absolute minimum that's required in order to still believe the resurrection, you include 0 additional facts, because it wouldn't be the minimum if you did. Now, there is another argument. You could say the quasi-minimum approach, minimal facts approach, or the half-minimal facts approach, or the most agreed-upon total facts approach. So the most agreed-upon facts approach is different than the minimal facts approach. The minimal facts approach is what are the absolute minimum of facts that you need in order to establish that the best conclusion is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's what he did here.
Okay. Well, with those minimum facts, I don't think it's sufficient enough to defeat the other hypotheses, and neither do they, because they use other facts when they try to defeat the other hypotheses.
No, they use other facts to support their
No, like the swoon
5
theory,
facts,
they use other facts to try to defeat the swoon theory or the hallucinations. So I don't.
Sure, but that's fairly obvious. The reason they're using.
I guess the crucified assume do they assume crucified to death when they say crucified?
Right.
Right. Yeah. So.
So they're saying
I think
crucified
people
to death
thought,
isn't
right,
crucified.
so Captain Modified that one.
The vast majority of scholars
Thought that he was
associated with the first fact. I'm sorry, I didn't let you finish. Say it again.
right. I would argue that with the first fact, we have to say that it was believed that Jesus died, but
Yes.
he didn't actually die.
Right. What most scholars are saying, agreed upon first fact, it is not the case that most scholars believe that he was crucified and survived.
Right. I agree with that.
Okay. And that's what they're saying. They're saying, given that most people believe he's crucified and died, then here's fact.
Says Paul in Galatians 6:17 says, "I bear on my body the marks of Jesus." Does it seem like he assumed Jesus had marks?
Why does it seem like an obvious reading to me?
Neither do I think yours seems like an obvious reading.
But so I mean, to a certain extent, we're just going to disagree in our interpretations of different things that we read.
Because we haven't
In my
agreed.
view, because you have a preconceived idea of what it should say.
Nope. No, that's not why we
But
won't
in
agree.
your view, it's because.
Whoa, time out. That's not why we won't agree. Why won't we agree?
You want
I'm
to use
telling
the
you why,
same
because we
measuring
won't
tool,
agree.
but I think he's
Yeah.
willing to use your measuring tool.
I
which
do
is
want-
the 5 facts, right?
No, the measuring tool is a whole panoply of like how we do historical analysis on texts, modern and ancient, all like the historical methods that we use. So using the standardly accepted historical methods, he's arguing that these 5 facts emerge from the data, from the evidence that we have. And just given those 5 facts, the best explanation of all of the facts together, not of a single fact, but the best explanation of the combination of all 5 facts, is that Jesus rose from the dead. The difference in our measuring sticks, so that if you use that they're using the standard historian's methodology. If you adopt that standard, I don't think that you're using the standards methodology if what you're saying is we're going to put forward a swoon theory that isn't evidenced.
I think it is evidence. I gave some possibilities.
What's
of
the evidence for that?
Evidence for it?
Yes. So you listed, you told a story that could
Right.
possibly
It's
have
plausible-
happened.
It's plausible. It's a plausible explanation of what happened with these facts.
So what is
And
the-
as long, in
what is
my
the
view,
evidence for
as
those
long as
things?
there's a plausible naturalistic explanation, we don't need a supernatural explanation.
Right, but
So
we're back
you
to
have
using wildly different yardsticks. But if I used your standard, I wouldn't accept, you already said you don't accept any historical facts based on that standard that talk about anything outside of what you expect are
No,
truths.
I accept the historical facts.
No, you said.
I don't accept miracles.
Right, so if there's a group of things here that are miracles, there's a group of things here that are not miracles, so these are miracles, these are not miracles. And all of these are potential facts. I guess that wouldn't work. These would be split right down the middle, wouldn't they? Sorry. Violating the law of exclusionability. So if you have alleged historical facts, these are miraculous, these are not miraculous. You have already said none of these are possible. historically to even establish.
To demonstrate, right.
Right.
And I use that same standard with Herodotus. I don't
Right.
examine those. I don't think you take plausible the supernatural explanations given in Herodotus or any other religious story.
No, I would.
So in my view, it's the Christians here who are not using this standard broadly. They only apply it to their own beliefs. You don't accept miraculous events in other contexts.
That's not true.
Okay, I mean, say that, but I don't think most Christians look at Herodotus and say, yeah, maybe all of these miraculous events happen in this battle. We should look into it.
So again, I'll tell you rather than you guessing.
Okay.
My standard for when there's a single ancient historical source is to turn around and do the kind of the historical method on it, which is you have to know what were the core beliefs of the people back then. What did they expect to see? What did they not expect to see? What did they believe was possible? What did they not believe was possible? What was their scientific knowledge? What was their spiritual knowledge? Now, what their spiritual knowledge is actually has meaning to me. So you deny the existence of the spiritual world, but I accept the existence of the spiritual world. And that spiritual world also has with it laws under which things operate. And some of those laws are outlined in some of these documents, and some of them are outlined potentially in other documents that are non-Christian.
Okay, then you're outside of historical method.
Well, hold on.
That's not historical method. The spiritual world.
I didn't say that was historical method. I said when I look at that, I'm looking at those two. Now, I still use the historical method on that. I'm entirely capable of using the historical method on that. Historical methods are the utilization of certain tools like let's look for primary sources. Let's look for subsequent manuscripts. Let's look for changes in those manuscripts. Let's date those. Let's turn around and do kind of forensic dating. Let's look at descriptions within the text itself to say, like it says this kind of pottery was there, but we know that the pottery didn't emerge for another 1,000 years, so that maybe that's implausible. I use criterions of embarrassment. I use assumptions like the historians write the history book, so you can expect oftentimes to see an emphasis on the success of the historical writers and sometimes not. And so I use all of those things in the same way against the supernatural world that I do against the natural world.
So when you read
now, I'm artificially delineating supernatural world and natural world. I deny the delineation. They are the same world. But for your sake, I will split them.
So when you read Herodotus,
yes,
and you read about a battle, and certain people are killed and one side wins, and then you read another story from Herodotus about Zeus sending down lightning bolts and Zeus doing this, and you don't make any distinction right off the bat about the plausibility of either of those stories?
I do. So I do. So when I read of ancient battles where the gods interfere and certain things happen, I will continue to look for additional evidence. Now, one of the problems is when you have a text, there's a limit. The text limits you as to what the methods are you can use in some cases. Additionally, set the text aside. Very, very frequently in ancient historical methodology, we only have the one text, right? We don't have, and we usually have super, super late copies of it, normally. So you're very limited in the toolkit that you can bring here. That is different when it comes to the Gospels and Paul. They are unusually well documented for an ancient historical series of events. So you have more you can apply more tools to this data set because the data set is broader and richer. For these more limited data sets, I don't turn around and say, they say Zeus sent a thunderbolt and it destroyed the gate of Troy or whatever. That didn't happen in the Homeric telling, but something like that happens. I may turn around and say, I think it's entirely possible that a lightning storm destroyed the thing. I wouldn't attribute it to Zeus. Now the question is, was that a natural occurrence that was just completely coincidental, or was that divine intervention by an actual God, not a false God? So I do think that God can throw thunderbolts if he wants to. I just don't think it's Zeus in the typically displayed.
Right, so to me, that's an inconsistency. Again, you believe in the miracles of your God, but you discount plausibility of miracles in other religions.
Not at all. I just told you that was a
that's
miracle.
how all religions.
All I said that they were wrong
You
about.
attribute it to Zeus, though.
Yes.
You said that God can throw thunderbolts.
Yeah, so what you'll notice what I'm doing is using a historical method to determine whether an alleged fact actually occurred.
But Herodotus
Now, my understanding
said
of,
that
yeah,
Zeus-
Herodotus attributes it to Zeus.
Right.
But you might say, as an example, let me give you another example from a spiritual nature. If it's the case that in history, we'll use a recent history event, right? And I don't know the truth to this one, so before anybody decides to know the truth to this one, I don't. We got a bunch of people who say JFK was killed by a single guy, right? Shooting from the library. We got a bunch of people, I don't know how many, I don't know what the percentages are, so make up whatever you think the percentages are. Got some other group who say there were multiple shooters. Okay, so there's already a little bit of disagreement about the facts, and we got doggone video of this, right? We got a couple, I think, of sets of video and photo from different angles. So fairly well documented. We still disagree over what the actual facts are occurred. I think we agree roughly how many shots were taken, but I don't think there's solid agreement on that one. And there have been certain bullets recovered. I think we agree on the number of bullets recovered, that kind of thing. And we certainly have good data on skull entry wounds and exit wounds and all that kind of stuff. Despite all that, and despite the fact we had a bunch of eyewitnesses, there's disagreement upon how many shots were fired and from where they were fired among the eyewitness accounts. Now, what I don't conclude then is because there's disagreement, whatever the primary explanation is false. Nor do I say, well, whatever the alternate explanation is true. Right? That's not enough. We have to turn around and do the difficult work of recognizing it is absolutely a fact that JFK was shot. But the questions remain: how was he shot? By whom? And ultimately, to the Zeus God point, who's behind it all? Right? So on the one side, maybe with full tinfoil hat, is like the CIA was going to kill him because they didn't like, I forget what it is the CIA was supposed to be upset about on this one. Or that the mob didn't like him because of whatever. So we got the CIA, we got the mob, we've got individual shooter who was cranky, maybe some, a number of things in between. But the fact that some historian writes on, so somebody writes a book on it, and they're like, and they wrote a really good book on it, right? The best possible evidential book with the most complete evidence you can possibly have. And all of that is beautifully done, let's say. I'm making this up. I don't know what book it would be. But the author's like, and I just take all this evidence to say the CIA did it, right? And that, I can still look at those data, use the historical method on those data, and disagree with the author's conclusion. And I'm entirely rational to do that. That's all I'm saying here.
But you're not
that's
putting
not
like a
supernatural.
miracle.
If someone came and said a demon did it, we
Or
would
a
just
ghost did it.
we should just automatically reject that
Right.
supernatural explanation for JFK's
Right,
death.
that's because you have,
That's not what anybody said.
that's because you have a standard, but that's not,
But that's a standard that makes sense. I mean, we would just be wasting our time if we.
it's a standard that
if we
makes sense
thought
to
that
you.
Demons killed JFK.
It's a standard that makes sense to you. It's not a standard that makes sense to a lot of other people. Now, the difference, though, between you and other people, is that you, from the very beginning, say, I'm not even going to look at this as an explanation.
Right, because I want to find real explanations.
Right, because you say any explanation that is spiritual is not real.
Right.
Right.
But
So
regardless of
there's
that,
no point having the discussion.
Even if we just go with what we're talking about, I don't think swoon theory, I don't think hallucination theory is I don't think you're successful in demonstrating.
Hold your point on
possible.
swoon. Hold your point on swoon theory real quick, Michael. I think we're going to talk about something.
I just wanted to. You mentioned a few different things like body burial, swoon theory, hallucination, things like that. I think all of those are, we could get into those, and we are. So in that vein, well, I could say something on all of them, but I just want to point out that, like, let's just look at hallucination. It seems to me that that's medically, mass hallucination is medically impossible. Whenever a hallucination occurs, it's always, an individual. If everyone sees their own individual hallucination, there's never a documented instance of, X hundred people all doing the same thing simultaneously.
There is, in fact, yes, many people. There are many examples of hundreds of people seeing the Virgin Mary in Lourdes, in France, and in Portugal, Fatima. Many examples of hundreds of people having a vision of Mary. There are still sites today that people go and do pilgrimages to because Catholics believe these to be true mass appearances. Also, I don't think among the 5 facts there is not the fact that this happened in a group setting. The only thing we have in the facts is that it says the 12, but can't be. It had to be the 11. The disciples believed that they saw him. I don't agree that we have solid evidence that all of them claim that. I think probably Peter, James, maybe a couple of
How do you explain that?
But before we go further, I want to first say this is factually incorrect. There are not mass hallucinations of people seeing Mary. That's not the case at Lourdes, nor is it the case in Spain. Just false.
Can you elaborate?
Okay. Can you elaborate on that?
A girl says she saw Mary a bunch of times, and when a bunch of people went out there, they saw a phenomenon in the sky that was like entirely consistent with the sun and clouds that they attributed to being some sort of divine sign of Mary. But there's a huge, this is where we with the historical methods then turn back and say, what were the agreed upon facts? Did 500 people say they saw Mary? No, they say they saw a sign in the sky. Okay, did dozens of people, hundreds of people say they saw Jesus? Yes.
No,
So that's the
not
difference.
accurate.
That is accurate. That's what Paul says.
It's not in the 5 facts that hundreds of people saw. Also, if you look at...
So, may I interrupt really quickly on that point?
I really want to...
And the reason I want to interrupt on that point is I just want everybody to know here, I want to reemphasize, the 5 facts are based on a body of evidence. The facts themselves are not evidence. The facts themselves are conclusion drawn from the evidence. So every time you say...
You always want to bring in the evidence from the side.
Every time there is no evidence in these facts. Zero evidence.
All right, let me finish what I wanted to say so I don't forget.
Okay.
You say that these people saw a light in the sky. According to Acts, that's exactly what Paul saw. Right? He saw some kind of light. He didn't see Jesus' body.
Form, right.
He claims to have heard his voice.
Yep.
But he attributed that sighting to Jesus. So it's exactly the same thing as what you're saying with Mary.
And what else happened?
In Acts, that's...
And he went blind.
Okay, yeah, I think he had some kind of medical event, which also explains why he would have a hallucination.
And then what happened after? Then another guy comes up to him within a couple days of that happening, identifies who he is, finds him miraculously, tells him that Jesus sent him to heal him, heals him of his blindness, and sends him off, right? So it's not like one bit of data of, I just saw a bright light and fell off my horse. It was, I saw a light, I heard a voice, I had a conversation. That conversation was 180 degrees out from what I thought it was supposed to be. I then was miraculously blinded. I then was miraculously healed by a guy who healed me in the same name of the guy that did this over here. Like that's a number of points of evidence. It's not just the same thing as at Lourdes a bunch of people saw.
Do you accept those things as actually having happened?
Because of the evidence. The evidence says those things happened.
No, it doesn't. It says that in Acts, but that's not really evidence.
Acts is the evidence. Acts is the text. When we're talking about using the historical method,
you can't just take anything out of it and accept it as true.
I didn't say you did. I said there's evidence. I said it was evidence.
I don't think it's evidence at all.
Evidence.
It's something written in Acts.
All right. What is evidence? Evidence for a claim is something that makes it more probable than the claim would be on the background alone. Okay. So if the idea is Paul saw Jesus, okay, evidence for that claim would be, so if you just say Paul saw Jesus, okay, well, what's the background possibility of that? Set your own probability of whatever you think it is, not possibility. What's the probability of that? All right, now we've got a document that says Paul saw Jesus in a vision. Okay, well, does that increase or decrease the probability that Paul saw Jesus over the background information, which is we just made it up? And that would be evidence for it. Now, it could be false, but we would want counter evidence to show that this evidence is false, that kind of thing. Now, I would like to repeat this point right here.
It's weak evidence.
Right. The strength of the evidence can vary wildly from like barely moving the needle to like, oh my goodness, how am I going to counter this? Yeah. Okay. But again, I think that the purpose of the historian is looking to build a cumulative case, and that's what Habermas and Lycone have done. Did you put your hand back up, sir? Okay, sorry. Alan? Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know. To me, there are other things with the Lord's example as well. You know, this girl saw it, and these other people came, and they saw something, and they interpreted it this way.
Yeah.
To me, it's very equivalent to what happened with Paul. I don't. Again, the citing of the 500 is not in the 5 facts. I don't think that it's historically accurate, and I don't think that we know that the disciples had sightings simultaneously. They may have had sightings at different times. The Gospels tell multiple different stories
So
of sightings.
this-
We don't know which ones are true.
You're making a category error frequently. When you say things like the 500 are not in the 5 facts, that's not true.
It is true.
And I'll tell you why.
Could you write the 5 facts up there?
I don't need to. I'm going to turn around and point to this to say if you're going
Because you're accepting
if you're
hundreds of other facts as part of the 5 facts.
if you're going to talk about these from a category perspective, contained in the 5 facts is this much evidence. The 5 facts are conclusions drawn from the evidence. Over here is evidence. Over here is no evidence. So when we say so, let's say that fact 3 is disciples claimed that they saw the risen Christ. Okay, that's one of the facts, is that his disciples claimed that they had experiences with the risen, of interacting with the risen Christ. Okay, that's one of the facts. That's one of the 5 facts, conclusions. It's not evidence. It's just a conclusion. Now, in that conclusion, that here in the set of the evidence is some subgroup of all of this evidence that supports this conclusion. Okay, so but I want you to know, the reason I spent a whole day on it was so that we would recognize that these are conclusions.
Which of the 5 facts? Which of the 5 facts requires 500 as evidence for it?
None of them require it. Which one uses it? The question, the fact that uses it as part of the evidence. So there's a group of evidence. So if you're going to make a conclusion, here's all of the evidence that's out there. This is all the writings, everything, right? And you say, well, I want to conclude that people saw Jesus. Okay, well, the fact that he was crucified, irrelevant. The fact, so you suss through all this and you gather together the evidence, the manuscripts, the copies of the manuscripts, the portions of them that speak specifically to the idea that Jesus was experienced risen by his disciples. In that group are a bunch of different things. Thomas saw Jesus, says he saw Jesus, right? Or this author records that this story with Thomas happened. These other 3 authors record that this thing happened with Mary. These 2 authors record that this thing happened with Peter. Okay, and you go through all these facts, right? I'll go through all this evidence right here, and you're looking for support for that fact. In that group of evidence would be 500 people saw him, according to Paul.
Fact
That Jesus, the disciples saw Jesus.
How does that relate to 500 people seeing Jesus?
It's
not a piece of evidence that is needed for that fact. And you are definitely you're saying, we're going to use these five facts to prove Jesus, and then you use hundreds of other pieces of evidence that are not in those 5 facts.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Say you have a court case, and someone's like, oh, I think the culprit was Joe, and everybody thinks Joe's dead. And someone says, no, I saw Joe walking down the street yesterday. Okay, that's a claim. But if you can find 500 other people who attest that I also saw Joe walking around the neighborhood, he's not dead. That's evidence to support that claim that Joe is in fact not dead. So that's, even though you're focused on the one person who's testifying in court saying, I saw Joe in my neighborhood yesterday, the fact that you have 500 people corroborating that supports that as well.
Right.
That's why it supports those
would be good evidence, but it's not necessary for any of the 5 facts.
You can say it's necessary. It's corroborative.
But the argument that we're trying to make is that these 5 facts demonstrate the conclusion that Jesus was raised from the dead. But instead of just using those 5 facts, all of this other evidence that is not accepted by scholars is being smuggled into the arguments, particularly against like hallucination theory, trying to bring in the 500. Most scholars don't accept the story of the 500.
So you know what I did not do a good job of doing. What I didn't do a good job of doing was explaining how they get to this conclusion. Let me try one thing and see if that helps. So the one thing I'd like to try that I think it'll help is.
Let me finish speaking. The 500 is not used by most scholars to come to any of these 5 facts. It's an extraneous thing that evangelicals accept, but scholars don't, because it's only written about in Paul. And most scholars feel that if there were 500 witnesses, that they would have been talked about in the Gospels later. There would be other sources, so they don't appear where they should appear. Evidence of that. If it happened as a major evidence for the resurrection, and it should appear in the Gospels in multiple places, and it just doesn't. So that's why they don't accept it.
But aren't you
Now,
also
Habermas
using it to
says,
support the mass hallucination theory?
what's that?
Aren't you also using it to support the mass hallucination theory?
No, because I don't think we need to. I think Peter had a hallucination and convinced and told it to other of the disciples, and there's a human psychological meaning or phenomenon called suggestion, and once someone else has claimed to see something, just like in Lord's, other people want to have seen it as well, and it can generate hallucinations. So maybe some of the other disciples also had hallucinations, or maybe they didn't, but they came to really believe that Peter had, so that they still believed that Jesus had returned, even without an experience of their own. And we know from Acts that an appearance could just be a light, and then some other context makes them interpret it as Jesus. So we don't really know exactly what they saw.
So it wasn't just a light.
You trust Acts now. You trust
No,
Acts.
I'm
You
not
said we
saying-
know from Acts.
No, we know from
You're
we know
attributing
from-
authoritativeness to Acts.
we
in
know
that
from
statement.
Acts that the author of Acts thought that would happen in a legitimate sight. I don't think that maybe that's what Paul saw. I don't know, but we know that they considered it to be a legitimate appearance of Jesus, because that's what they wrote. Whether it's historical or not, I don't know.
So I would like
Probably
to.
it is, because if they wanted to make it up, they would have said that Paul saw his body. I don't think that they would make up that he just saw a light. So I think there's some plausibility to that aspect of Acts being historical, because it meets the criterion of embarrassment to a certain extent. But I'm not certain about it, but it certainly shows us that Christians would consider seeing a light as an appearance of Jesus.
So I'll disagree with that one based on the evidence that we have, and the evidence is it wasn't just nowhere in the scripture, 0 places, does it say a person saw a light and thought it was Jesus. It just didn't happen. Completely false. What it did happen in scripture is Paul saw a light, the people around him saw a light, and Paul heard a voice. And then Paul was also blinded, and then Paul was also healed, according to Acts. Now, back to your point about Lord's, that exactly underscores the point of using the historical method on examples like Lord's. So you said a bunch of people saw a light at Lord's, and then they interpreted it as a vision of Mary, potentially. Now, nobody at Lord's turned around and said, we saw Mary. They said, we saw a light. And they took it as a sign from heaven. They didn't take it as necessarily an appearance of Mary. In the gospel accounts and in Acts, the appearances were not a light that they interpreted to be Jesus. They talk about having a conversation with Jesus. So this is a very good example of what the difference between so in Lord's, I think we all agree, weird sunlight, right? We can agree that happened. And in the Gospels, the question is, what did these guys see? So it sounds to me like you're saying only Peter possibly saw Jesus. Everybody else saw a light or were convinced by Jesus, and then they fabricated the rest of it.
Possibly. We don't really know. I don't think the gospel accounts are so different. Like, Mark doesn't even have an appearance account.
Right.
If there were appearance accounts, I think it would be in Mark. I think he would have written about it. And you see a clear development theologically over time from Mark to Matthew to Luke to John. It gets more and more theological, and
So,
Matthew, there's a...
Great. Let's use the historical method, and let's think about exactly that. And let's go back to JFK. Okay, the first reports that came out about JFK were like short, brief, oral accounts of what happened, wildly contradictory in many cases. Turns out a lot of them appeared to be contradictory. Turns to be out you could stitch a lot of them together. You'd be like, oh, this person saw from this angle, this person saw from that angle. And the accounts were small. And very few of them talked about the events leading up to it. And very few of them talked about the events that happened after it. They were focused on what they considered to be the important event. Somebody writes a book about it. Then somebody says, you know what's missing from that book? An account of what the forensic data were, or an account of whatever this was. And even in the case of JFK, over an event that we know for a fact happened, you see exactly that same pattern.
We don't see the appearance of angels.
Nope, that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what I'm talking about.
Hold
on, wait, time out. That's not what I'm talking about.
You're talking about the story gets more developed.
I'm talking about the criticism that you just levied was because Mark was this big and it only accounted for these events. and other
It didn't
things.
have appearances at all.
Mark was this big and accounted for these events. That anything that fills in the gaps, before or after, is suspect. Now, you say that about the Gospels, but you don't say that about JFK.
I do. I think a lot of facts about JFK are suspect.
So you think the first accounts that came out about JFK was, I'm sitting here listening to this shot happened, a bunch of Secret Servicemen dove in there, and they rushed him off to the hospital, and that's where the story ended. That when somebody else writes a story that was like, now, once he got to the hospital, this is what happened, A, B, C, D, and E. Now, who would know that? The public? Nope, they were all shut out. Who's the only people who know that? Secret Service and a few medical people around him. By the way, this sounds very familiar compared to Jesus, right? The first people who knew about him were the inner group, etc. That's exactly the same historical pattern. Exactly. So just because somebody wrote additional stuff after the initial account does not turn around and say, therefore,
still don't know what happened with JFK.
what we do know is that he got shot in the head. And this is their point.
Right.
Right.
So we have these 5 basic facts, but we don't have all these other facts that you're trying to bring in.
Right. Now to the point I was trying to make. Something I did a bad job of was explaining how they get to this conclusion. I think I did a bad job of it because we keep hitting this point. All right, I think we've hit there's evidence and then facts. The facts are conclusions drawn from the evidence that these guys are saying most of the scholars agree with. The second part of the process is then to say there are a number of hypotheses out there, hypothesis 1 through 5. I made up the number. There are more, there are fewer, depending on how you define it. Now, when you're turning, these were explanations. If you're going to have an explanation of the fact, there's another set of criteria you adopt when you say which hypothesis or theory best accounts for the facts that we agree on. So physicists get the JWST out and a bunch of radio telescopes, and they put all the data together, and they're like, all right, whose theory of the early universe best fits this fact pattern? Is it lambda CDM theory? Is it eternal universe theory? Is it, Carol Chin model of the universe? Like, which one of these fits the facts the most? And this is how we do cosmology, right? We turn around and we say, given the facts that we agree on, that are good, and somebody will run an experiment, and a bunch of people will be like, I don't know about the experiment, let's double check it. Those results seem a little sketchy, and then they try to replicate it and all that stuff. By the time we're done, we're like, okay, we agree that this is what happened. Which of these explanations fits the facts? And in science, what we do is say, explanation 5 doesn't account for facts 3, 4, 5 at all. Okay, so it gets 1 and 2. It's got its good explanation 1 and 2. It's not a good explanation 3, 4, and 5. Explanation 4 doesn't fit any of it. Throw that one out. Explanation 3 gets 4 of them, but man, it doesn't make any sense in respect to 1. And then they go back and forth and they say something like, well, explanation 2 has an explanation of all the facts, and that's called explanatory power. Does it have the power to explain all of the agreed upon facts? And so it's not the only criterion, but explanatory power is a criterion that we use to decide which of the explanations is the most preferred. And so this process of, let's call it explanation ranking, of like which one is the most explanatory, which one is the best explanation, from an inference to the best explanation, which one are we calling the best? That in this one right here, the whole argument of this book is that an explanation particularly, that Jesus rose from the dead, is the best explanation in terms of explanatory power, in terms of fitting the fact pattern that was out there, in terms of fitting other things we know about reality, etc. Now, obviously, I'll say on that last one, if your understanding of reality is, I don't know if there's anything out there that's supernatural, but I highly doubt it to the point that I won't recognize evidence for it, even if it happened in front of me, then there's no way that you're going to agree on that as a criterion. And so the reason that I spent weeks on something that I would not have otherwise spent weeks on, number one is because I love you too, like genuinely. And I mean that like on 2 fronts. There's the Christian I love you, which is like, God told me I have to love you, so I love you, right? That sort of counts, but it doesn't really count.
So it has a punishment factor.
Yes, like if you don't love those guys, you're in real trouble. Okay, fine, I love them, right? Thanks. Tell your brother you apologize. I'm sorry. Doesn't sound like you're sorry. Well, I said the words. Okay. There's the other one, which is I do love you guys. You guys are awesome. You've been a lot of fun to interact with. I like you a lot. I want the best for you. I genuinely do. So when I do this, like I don't waste time on people who I think can't do it. So you're not the first atheist to walk in this class. And you won't, God willing, you won't be the last. I've spent this time on here because I not only care about you, but I think that you are, are good people who can be reasonable. I'm frustrated. And the reason you're frustrating me is while we sat in this class, and I'm frustrating me because I love you, right? If I didn't care about you, all I had to do was do what I do and then walk out. You guys walk out and I'm like, see, this is how it goes. And the rest of this class would be like, yep, that's right. That's how it goes, right? The easy win for me. That's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to show you I love you. Now, here's what you're doing that's bothering me, brother and sister. As usual,
It is mostly
the best conversations we have in solid ground occur in the 15 minutes after we get done with solid ground right out there, right? We just need to start recording those and send them out as like part 2, the real discussion. In that one, we agreed that, I think we agreed, that we're using different measuring sticks. And the example that I used was we're standing out in the foyer there and we're looking out the window and there's my truck sitting out there. And I said the truck's 100 meters away. And she says the truck's 50 meters away. And I'm like, okay, well, this is something we can measure. We agree we can measure it? Yes. Okay, what yardstick are we going to use? And I'm like, here's my yardstick. And it's this tall. And I'm like, that's 3.3 feet, that's a yard. And you break out your yardstick. And you're like, here's my yardstick. Or I'll make me the knucklehead. This is your yardstick, and here's my yardstick. Right? And we should look at those two and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. These are not the same. An unreasonable claim, an unreasonable effort would be, we disagree on the yardsticks, let's do the measurement anyway. Right? Not going to make any sense. Alternately, if you said something like this, I don't believe that physical measurements are even possible. Then for me to turn around and say, well, okay, but let's measure it anyway, that would be unreasonable. But that's where I feel like we are.
But
We
I
have
said
said,
something that you really didn't like out
Okay,
there,
yeah, sure.
which was you do have to take that leap and believe. You can't prove based on scientific method, you can't prove based on historical method that conclusion is the best one. You have to make that leap and believe that it could happen. And you didn't like that. You wanted to be able to prove it. And we don't think you can prove it based on scientific method, based on historical methods. You have to believe that miracles happen. You have to have that leap.
yeah, so now we're in exactly the same measurement problem. But now we're talking about a second thing. So the first thing, we're assuming the analogy of the measurement was about these things. But there was another one. There was the epistemology measurement. How do we know it's true in the first place? So I actually agree with you 100%. But the difference is we're completely reversed based on expectation. So when it came to the scientific side, what I think that I'm hearing from the skeptics table here, and we do need to put somebody who's not an atheist at this table, just so that we yes, that in this side, the normal assumption is the religious people will just at some point shut their brains off to the facts and instead say you just got to make the leap and believe. Okay, now I think we've gone into a great degree here to try to demonstrate that that's not the case. We're trying to use the same tools everybody else does, or at least we're claiming to. We agree that we do, and so we can just debate about how well we're doing that. But jump over to the epistemology problem. How do I know anything? How do I know something's true? Now it's reversed. Now I'm the one saying I need logic and evidence. And in reality, it's less, when it comes to epistemology, scientific evidence is not something you can use. You can never scientifically establish.
Isn't that the whole point? Say it back again.
So, well, I'll finish the point and come to that side in case that's distracting. On this side, on the epistemology side, you're the one saying you just have to take a leap of faith and believe. And I'm like, no. We have to rigorously use logic and evidence for this too. So my truth discovery.
I don't think you can prove it just with those things.
But I think you can.
What do you mean by prove?
Yeah, now the question
As far as
is.
we know, it's the best of us.
Now the question is, what do we prove? Now I will agree on this one too. Proving. So here's the reason. Normally we would say something like this. Let's see if this makes sense to you. Proving that I had a coffee cup up here during this class, seems to be like it's something that we ought to be able to agree on that we can do. Aside from the, like, maybe nothing's real, perhaps this was all a hallucination. Like, we can prove fairly easily that this coffee cup is here. If I said I had a coffee cup here 2 years ago, that gets harder to prove. If I said there was a guy here with a coffee cup 200 years ago, that's even harder to prove. And by the time we get to 2,000
But it's
years.
still a real thing in a real place. And
Okay.
So it's not a
Now
miracle, and it's not.
So that's exactly my point. Now listen to what happened on this is an epistemology question. This is very, very important. I'm glad that you brought this up. I cannot tell you how happy this makes me that you brought this up. We brought up last time that if what's her name? Who was the X-Men?
Jean Grey.
Jean Grey. Walked in here and in actual fact, objectively used her mind in some way using the natural world that we don't know about. And she levitated the coffee cup and moved it around the room. You still would not accept that truth. That is a big, big blind spot in your epistemology. It's something that happened literally in front of you that you say, I can't know the truth about it. That's a problem. And that's a difference where we disagree. I think you can use logic and evidence, and you're saying I'm not going to, I will hopefully use logic, but I deny the evidence that's in front of me. In fact, I deny the firsthand evidence of what's in front of me if it doesn't fit within my very, very narrow view of what actually can happen. Now, here's an exact example of that happening in history. Laplace, one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. I listened to you when you said, let me finish the point. Let me make the point.
You're making a point about something I didn't say.
Oh, okay. Correct me.
I said I couldn't trust my own judgment, but I said it could be demonstrated if I brought in a magician, if I brought in experts, and they looked at the situation and they did a controlled experiment and they found out what happened. So I'm not ruling out that it could be demonstrated that she had this power.
Yep. Right?
I'm ruling out my expertise in coming to that conclusion based simply on me seeing it.
Fair enough. Let me follow up.
So that's a completely different thing.
Let's follow that up. How would to your satisfaction, how would a magician tell you, like what evidence would they have to use to determine whether or not that fact occurred?
I mean, I don't know. If I knew that, then I could do the experiment myself. But I would trust that they are experts, and then they would explain to me how they're going to control for it.
Okay,
and I would either accept that or not.
The point is we don't know what we don't know.
Right, and I'm not rejecting out of hand the possibility of
and we're also saying
that being demonstrated to me.
You don't know what else.
This right here is a picture of what happens when you reject things out of hand. You are rejecting.
I do reject that. If Jean Grey did that, I would reject supernatural explanations for it.
Right.
I would only accept a natural explanation for it.
So what if it
any event could happen, like Jesus could have been resurrected.
So what if it was actually the case that Jean Grey did that supernaturally?
Then we can't know it.
Right.
Could, I'm not saying that.
So back to the epistemology point, then we can't know it. That means there's no evidence that I'll accept for it. There's no way to possibly know that.
But we can know that it happened.
Now,
we didn't know the cause. We couldn't understand the cause. So that's why I still think that this is valuable. Maybe Jesus was resurrected from the dead naturally. Maybe some kind of weird quantum event happened. Right. So I think that we can still, even if I don't accept the supernatural element, that's like the last step. So we could still look at your 5 facts and see and agree on the measuring stick to determine what conclusions they might lead to. So maybe resurrection is a conclusion, a naturalistic resurrection.
I'll tell you why I can't.
Or maybe there are these other hypotheses.
I'll tell you why I disagree with that. I'm unwilling to agree with you on the measuring stick. If you think that multiple people eyewitness evidence of something is not adequate to establish that something happened.
We still know what we don't know.
But if that's the case,
in this case, though, we don't have.
Do you understand there's a contradiction between saying we don't know what we don't know, and we know for a fact that there's nothing supernatural? Do you see the contradiction?
I didn't say it. I know.
I'm talking to her specifically. This isn't referencing what you're saying. This is referencing what she's saying. There's a contradiction there. To say, I affirm the fact that there are unknown things out there, and I don't even know what those unknown things can be. For all I know, there's a bunch of stuff that exists. Okay, what about supernatural things? Definitely doesn't exist. Which one of those? You got to pick one. You can't have both.
I'm saying there are other things that are natural explanations that could take care of those 5 facts, and it's not. I don't think you've proven it to the point where it has to be a miracle. It has to be God rose Jesus from the dead.
There you go.
I'm satisfied by the other.
And that's my point, is if you turn around and say something like this, as a background assumption, there's a possibility that it was a miracle. Then, like Kona and Habermas's argument goes through, is what they're saying. If you say, not possible, we're only picking from the best naturalistic explanations, that means you're only looking at this set right here. You already X'd out this one. Now, Habermas and Lycona don't X out that, and neither do the people in this room. So you can't preemptively strike a hypothesis if you're going to be allegedly open-minded about it. And by saying miracles do not occur and every naturalistic explanation is automatically preferred with no argument to that point, that's not reasonable. Nor is it using the other person's measuring stick. That's what using different measuring sticks looks like.
If we can, first off, I think it's perfectly, one of the reasons why that's important to me is because I think that it's very dangerous supernatural thinking is very dangerous. So I think not only is it reasonable to get rid of E1 at the beginning, it's necessary if we're to have reasonable discussion at all. But
can you clarify what you mean by dangerous?
I think supernatural thinking leads to witch burnings, which still happen in Africa. People are killed as witches because they accept supernatural events. It leads to all kinds of unreasonable ideas, and like can be magically healed. I don't need to take chemotherapy because this spiritual healer said that they're going to heal me. It has all kinds of negative effects to have this, what Carl Sagan called a demon-haunted mind.
Yes.
To believe in all this stuff. But to leave that aside.
And I don't want to leave that aside. I want to ask the following question. Hold on, you're basing it on it. I want to ask the question. If it's dangerous, does that mean that we're not supposed to believe in it as a possible true explanation?
No, not necessarily, but if it's true, then you could still believe it, I suppose, whether it's dangerous or not.
So why did you list that as a criterion of why we shouldn't believe it?
Because it's also untrue.
Well, but you don't know that the fact that it's dangerous has nothing to do with whether it's true or untrue, right?
Right. I think it's untrue and dangerous.
Okay.
So
well, I think that's
why it's important to me. If it was just untrue, but it didn't have an effect.
I think that about atheism, right? And atheism leads to the Holocaust. Atheism leads to Mao's starvations in China. Atheism leads to Stalin's purges. Like that's the practical function of atheism and not valuing human life. So that's dangerous and it's untrue. So now what am I supposed to do? Burn atheists?
That's what has been done through much of history.
Okay, well, I don't do that because I love atheists, both because I'm ordered to.
I disagree with that, of course. But anyway, I think we can look at E2, E3, E4, E5, and if those are plausible, then we don't even need to get to E1. But if you can convince me that E2, E3, E4, E5, there's no way that any of those things happen, then I think you're closer to E1. So I think it's still useful to do this exercise on the other hypotheses, even if we don't get to E1. Or if we disagree, if you eliminate all the other E2, E3, E4, E5, and then I accept either that we don't know anything at all about what happened, or there was a naturalistic resurrection, we're still closer to your position in E1. So you've still gained ground if you're able to demonstrate E2, E3, E4, E5 are not plausible. So it's still useful for us to discuss the alternative hypotheses, I think, from your perspective.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is whether we can do that or not has nothing to do with the question of whether we're being fair in our assessment.
Well, E2, E3, E4, E5, we have the same measuring stick of naturalistic.
No, we obviously don't have the same measuring stick. We don't even agree on the historical method, so we don't agree on that yet.
This is a broad statement, possibly maybe a topic changer, maybe just something to think about for next time. I can't speak for everyone in this class. I can only speak for myself, but I love this conversation, mainly because I've got very good friends of mine, people who stood up behind me at my wedding, who I love, and I have the exact same conversations with them that kind of stand in your camp. So, these kinds of conversations are not a bore or taxing. I think that's why I'm personally here in solid ground. And I suspect that there are other people who feel likewise. But in that vein, I don't really, I haven't really had a chance to talk to you directly, so I don't know, why you're here and why, not in a negative sense, but in a positive sense. Like, is this achieving what you hope it's going to achieve? Are you gaining what you want out of it? My question is, and I said this at the first or second week of the actual class when we were doing this, I view Gary Habermas's argument as a rhetorical for people who generally accept this bulk of scientific data out there, it's like, well, if you accept the preponderance of the data, then this is a reasonable position to hold. But it's in my opinion, it's kind of a looser sort of argument, and compared to other arguments that we have, like the teleological argument, the cosmological argument, things like that, where you have much more simple premises and hard deductive or inductive proofs for those. So I feel like this conversation, personally, I'd be curious to hear. I realize that that's completely different, like topic change. Probably done a lot of research on Gary Habermas, and to just suddenly bring in premise 2, the cosmological argument, like that's whoa. But I know what you're thinking, Scott. It doesn't address the core issues, which is we need to agree on standards and we need to agree on like logic itself in order to have any dispute. But I still wonder if, and again, probably not for tonight, but for another time, if having those core arguments when you're talking about epistemology, when you're talking about truth, having those in the context of another argument, cosmological, theological argument, just because those are more simple and I guess pure arguments, it's much more logical or philosophical, and it's a lot less talking about the historical accuracy of a bunch of, historical accounts. It removes all that historical accounting. It's just talking about philosophy.
Yeah, as usual, Michael has very eloquently and concisely said the point that I was trying to make. So I will repeat this on this scale because this was what I was trying to get to that we kind of got lost in. If you're looking, when you use the term proof, that can be anything from rigorous mathematical proof all the way down to like, can I prove that I had bacon this morning, based on whatever else. This is a point I mentioned and I'm trying to make, and Michael's 100% right about this. The minimal facts argument for like this is what actually happened. This sits down here in in my mind, this is like the 15% one.
Yeah.
Like that the
Talk about this a little bit.
yeah, and the standards of proof out there. That's how, in order to believe this explanation, I think you have to fully confident that God exists and that not only does he exist, he interferes in the world in specific ways for specific purposes. Absent those two beliefs, it's not plausible. So over here, in my opinion, there are, the ontological argument is 100% proof. The cosmological and teleological arguments are 90% plus proof. Okay, and you can go on down the line of things that are proofs. In my opinion, this whole discussion really sits at the epistemological side. We can have according to your assumptions, maybe it's less plausible. Okay, well, according to your assumptions, it's completely impossible. So there's no point in having a discussion there. This discussion should be had around the things that are the best proofs for it. At that point, then we'll really see where the measurement standard lies, right? Because if we're talking about things that are deductive arguments, then there presumably would be no disagreement about whether the logic is valid. That should be obvious. It's just whether plus or minus means add or subtract. That should be obvious. And then the strength of the premises are the only things that you're down to. And these are not the premises of those arguments. None of them are wild or even assume spirituality of any type, right? So that would be a good place to have this discussion, which to all of this point, to Michael's point, I genuinely think there's no point in doing the 5 facts with you.
Right, to a lot of extent I agree. I mean, this is a different question. It's whether God exists. But if we come to different conclusions about that, then we have different
standards of epistemology.
Right. So if I became convinced that God existed, then E1 might be back on the table, right?
Great.
So
that's the whole point. And my point is why have the discussion if you're going to take the Habermas and Lycona, if you're going to preemptively take Habermas and Lycona's conclusion off the table, there's no point in talking about Habermas's.
Well, I think there's a point because say you're able to demonstrate that to me, then if you're later able to demonstrate that God exists, then I've already been convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, and then I can accept Christianity rather than some more vague. All the arguments for God give us kind of a more vague demonstration.
I understand where you're coming from on that, and the reason I disagree with you, though, is you'd probably believe that I have blind spots. But I believe that not only do you have blind spots, that we've conclusively determined where that blind spot is.
I don't think it's a blind spot. I've looked at all these arguments for God, extensively, and I think that I've come to the correct
that's not what I'm talking about. So, but I believe that we've identified where the blind spot is, or let's say the spot that you said I'm not even willing to look. But that blind spot right there so completely affects this that there's no point in having this discussion. I think we should have that discussion. Al.
Yeah, there's a question I've been meaning to ask for a while, because I've heard from, like I was watching a video
Excuse me.
yesterday, but I've heard from other atheists, including Bill Nye, the idea that you mentioned about how Christians shouldn't bring their religious beliefs, particularly belief in miracles, into their scientific empirical studies. And my question is, when you bring your metaphysical belief regarding naturalism, that you a priori reject any supernatural explanation for anything you observe, isn't that, why should you be allowed to bring that belief with you into your scientific studies? And it will, because that will affect at least some of your conclusions.
There are two different kinds of naturalism. There's metaphysical naturalism, and then there's methodological.
That's the one.
Naturalism, right? So, just because you use methodological naturalism doesn't mean you have to be a metaphysical naturalist. You could believe in supernatural entities, but use methodological naturalism. That's what people like Francis Collins and other scientists who are religious still accept methodological naturalism, because that's the way science works. It just doesn't allow for supernatural explanations that's not within the rules of science. Just like in chess, I can't pick up a piece and run through a goal, right? That's not how you play chess. So you don't play science using miracles.
But see, that's
Francis Collins had to figure out the human genome using methodological naturalism.
No,
he couldn't just say God did it, right? He had to demonstrate through scientific methodology how the genome works.
But that doesn't rule out all the supernatural explanations.
That's not what I'm doing. When I say this, I don't know how many times I have to say it. I'm ruling out using the scientific method to demonstrate miracles. I'm not ruling out that a miracle happened.
Mm-hmm.
Those are completely different things. And I'm saying A, I'm not saying B. Although I don't believe that a miracle happened. That's a different question as to whether science or historical method can demonstrate that.
Okay, so on this point, let me ask the following question. So here's an example of the difference between what you and Al are saying. There's a lady named Barbara Snyder who is famous among people who talk about miracle stuff. Okay, Barbara Snyder had MS to the point that she was cared for by a live-in, attendant. So her legs had atrophied, her calves, were this big around. She had a collapsed lung. She was in curled up fetal position kind of stuff. So one day her family hear her yelling, and they walk in, and she's moving around in a wheelchair. They move her from the wheelchair to the bed kind of thing. So she was in bed. She's standing up and walking around, and her mother's like, "You can't be walking around. What are you doing? You're going to hurt yourself." And the other person's like, "Your calves are back. 2 hours ago, you had no calves. Your calves are back." The assistant comes in and is trying to get her back into the bed because she's like, "What's going on?" And the lady's like, "I'm good, 100%. They take her to the hospital. The lung's not collapsed anymore. Calves are all regrown, instantly regrown, not like she PT'd her way to it, all this kind of stuff. It sounds very much like a miracle, right? The two doctors that were taking care of her subsequently write books about this because they're like, no medical explanation of this one at all. Now, what were the data of what happened? So medical science looks at it and says, shrug, we got no explanation. Her explanation was she heard a voice tell her my daughter get up and walk. And she attributes it to Jesus. And then she stands up and walks. Okay, so heavily documented, multiple people, modern times, physicians you can talk to, all that other kind of stuff. Under methodological naturalism, the hypothesis that she was miraculously healed is completely off the table.
Yes.
In his world,
But not in metaphysical, in metaphysical naturalism, so let me retract that. In metaphysical naturalism, you would say, yes, it can't be a miracle. But with
methodological naturalism.
methodological Methodism, all we could, methodological naturalism,
Yes.
all we could say is we can't demonstrate that it's a miracle, and so methodological naturalism doesn't provide us with the tools we need to understand this situation.
Bingo. And what he's saying is he thinks we should use the tools that would allow us to discover whether it's a
Maybe
case.
but those are different tools than methodological naturalism. And science falls within methodological naturalism. So I'm not saying
I agree with you. Like I feel like I was the guy making this point. What I'm trying to say is if you're gonna diagnose a car of what's going on wrong with the car, sometimes you need more than one tool. Okay, you plug in the little thing that gives you the code. You look at the code and it's like, could be one of these 5 things. And you're like, and the good mechanic is like, yep, normally it's this one. He checks for it with another tool. He uses a screwdriver to open this thing. It's in there. Sometimes he looks at it and he's like, yep, it doesn't fit. Like what I know about the symptoms don't fit these things. I know the computer's telling me that, but I know when this other thing's out. And then he uses his experience and knowledge to then fix the problem. Okay, multiple tools are sometimes what you need to solve the problem. And all I'm saying is,
right.
why restrict yourself to only using one tool if your job is to discover the truth?
I'm not. All I'm saying is that the historical method and the scientific method are not the right tools.
Fair enough. Let me ask the question. Why would you use methodological naturalism to evaluate claims of miracles?
You shouldn't. That's my point. My point is that you are misapplying these tools. You're trying to use methodological naturalism to prove a miracle. And that's not how it works. That's why I've been making this distinction between saying a miracle didn't happen and we can't demonstrate a miracle.
I'll restate. I think you misunderstand my position. I think you should use methodological naturalism and logical assessment and knowledge of this other data pulled by another set of tools that also, one of which is methodological naturalism. I'm saying I think you should use 3 tools to solve it. I think I'm hearing you say, I only ever use methodological naturalism, none of the other stuff counts.
No, I don't say that at all.
Anything we can demonstrate outside of historical or science.
Yes, well, way over time. Okay, we'll continue this discussion next time, or probably we'll have the best part of this discussion outside again.
Are we going to discuss a different issue, or are we going to stick with, do we want to move to the ontological argument or some other?
I would give my left leg to move to the ontological argument, if you're willing to do it.
Fine with me, man.
Great, you got time? Great. You also, this week I've got some time that you guys want to link up.
Sure.
Okay. Yes, so next time, Michael starts the conversation.
Ontological argument?
Well, whichever one.
General arguments for the existence of